Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Chris Mills, head of product at Nexleaf, a nonprofit working at the intersection of global health and technology to protect vaccines. Chris, I'm so excited to chat with you. We love having product people on the show, not only from your perspective and your opinions on how you view building, but also it offers a different perspective to kind of the needs of the company, and really excited to not only dive into your background, but also Nextleaf and kind of what you're working on, how you're attacking your customers' problems, and how you kind of view building product overall that might give our audience a really cool insight into products that they might be building, or if they're ahead of product and they're kind of trying to structure and build things to kind of be game changing or disruptive in a lot of different ways. So before we get into all that, Chris, with Nextleaf and what you're doing, the initiatives there, what were you doing before you joined the company?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really glad to be here. Before joining Nexleaf, I was working in tech. So I've spent most of my time working in small to medium-sized businesses, some startups pre-seed, some Series A or beyond, but usually that kind of smallish range. And yeah, I was really excited to find Nexleaf. It's my first time working in a nonprofit. So I'm just really excited to be here.
Yeah. And then thinking about just like how different building product is at a small to medium sized company versus like a large company, describe like the difference in velocity and how quickly you have to be adaptable to the different changes or different customer feedback you're seeing. And how do you kind of categorize what is the most important piece to consider in terms of the next build in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's actually the same problems for large companies as for small companies. It's important to move quickly. I think the larger you are, the longer you can go without realizing how important it was. Whereas like small
Right.
companies, you get it wrong, you'll probably be dead in a year. Whereas like a big company, maybe you go 5, 10 years without realizing like, oh nuts, I've ignored my customers. But
Right.
it's really kind of a difference in how you do that rather than what you do. So I think at smaller companies, I just see a lot more kind of like full stack ownership of product, if you will. There's a lot
Yeah.
less handoffs. It's a lot more like, I'm going to go talk to this customer. I'm doing the user research. I'm doing discovery. I'm doing prototyping. So at the larger
Yeah.
companies, you can kind of build more specialty into those functions and you have more teams working together to operate at
Yeah.
that scale. But yeah, it's same ideas.
Yeah. And I'm always curious. I think a lot of founders are curious as they're looking to grow and scale their team. If they're not a kind of coming from a product background or maybe coming from a different background, when is it necessary to bring on a head of product? Is it a certain amount of users? Is it a certain funding round? Is it a team size? What kind of, I guess, signals, if I'm a founder looking to bring on a head of product, would I look for to be notice that I'm ready to bring somebody on board to specialize in that focus?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think a lot of people probably want to have like a really clear like threshold signal, like, this is the point where it makes sense
Yeah.
to bring somebody on. I think it's a little more nuanced than that. It's like
Yeah.
the way I think about it is, again, it's kind of that full stack perspective. Like when you're first starting out, I think it can be too soon to bring in like a capital P product person because
Yeah.
you don't want to miss out on all that like rich understanding of your users and what they do and what they value. You don't want to outsource that to somebody else, even if it's within the company. I think it's really crucial for founders to know that for themselves. But then somewhere beyond the very genesis of an idea, you get some traction. It's like, oh, there's stuff here. You begin to kind of understand all the different ways that value can be created. And I think at that point,
Yeah.
that's when like more product discipline really starts to make sense because it's like, hey, we've proven the V1 of this, but there's a lot more to explore. And we're not kind of like optimizing, we're like really maximizing
Yeah.
all the different value. We've like hit the top 3 bullet points, but we're trying to really flesh it out. That's where I think a
Yeah.
lot of product discipline, that's kind of the sweet spot in my mind.
Yeah. And like when you come into a company, what problem sets are you seeing that they have? Is it they have, say, a roadmap that they have planned out, but all of a sudden they're getting requests for different features. You need to hone in on what exactly is going to be valuable to work on. Or is it having all these kind of disparate, maybe pieces of a product and then just honing in on exactly the focus or the customer that you're looking to attract? Where do you come if in most cases, what is the organization at and what is kind of like your first objective joining the company?
Yeah, I love that question. I think usually what I would describe is like just this sense of confusion. It seems like what happens as you grow is like
Yeah.
you've maybe delivered on your MVP, but before long, just stuff is happening, but it doesn't feel very cohesive. It doesn't feel like the pieces fit together
Yeah.
anymore. And that's
Yeah.
usually a sign to me that you're neglecting some of that like product thinking within the org. You're neglecting the ability to kind of like orient what you're building in the user's perspective. Like, how is this going to matter to the people that I'm selling this to or that I'm giving it to? And I think that's the anchoring that like good product people bring to companies, is like, you're always kind of saying like, okay, well, why would our users care about that? Like, why does it matter to them? And once you have that, I think you start to realize that many problems are like compound problems. It's like you have to solve 10 different sub problems to actually get the result you're looking for. And what you'll find is like you've been solving maybe 5 or 6 of them and seeing nothing. And that's because you still need to solve like these last 4, but those last 4 are not as obvious or intuitive. That's the kind of stuff that's like, oh, I need to frame it in this way. I need to add this feature of that. And then it will really get the traction we're looking for.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I feel like a lot of founders, like one founder, maybe 2, you co-founders, they have a full stack developer, they built that MVP, they might have even outsourced to a dev shop. But I think we all as founders kind of get caught up in what's working, or if we build this piece out, how are people going to interact with it? But I love that why question, taking a step back and kind of going through the user experience and consumer experience to see what their journey is, to really see where the value is. And are there different tools that help you track and identify what people are using? If it's like a web page and you have something overlaid on it, kind of seeing where people go throughout their journey, what kind of tools do product owners or heads of product use and utilize to really weigh what the user's experience in, rather than just think about it intuitively and going through the product experience there? What are some actual quantitative measurements that you can take to get that kind of focus or obtain that insight to move forward?
Yeah, really good question. Like there's a ton of product metric companies. I've worked with a handful of them. I think they're all good and they all have their place. We use Full Story at Nexleaf, which is a certain kind of like product intelligence platform, if you will. Yeah. And the one thing I really appreciate about Full Story is the ability to get that, like at a remote company, it's very hard to get sort of the over the shoulder experience. Like I'm sitting behind you watching you use my prototype or my demo. There's something about like Zoom and Google Meet and stuff that just doesn't quite translate. And it's really nice to be able to get something like that with Full Story, to see like actual user interactions on their site. Like I can see the mouse kind of hover back and forth between two things that aren't certain. So it does a really good job, I think, of replicating that sort of over the shoulder look. And then anything that brings your kind of core metrics into light is going to help. I think anything that shows you, hey, what features are people using? What pathways are they navigating through the site? It's a good resource for getting insights into the kinds of things you want to follow up with in user research. Right. It's like, oh, I saw somebody like do this thing and I'm confused. Why would they do that? Let me go ask, like, hey, what were you doing? What were you trying to do when you did this?
Yeah. And what would you say, once you come into a team, what's like the ideal team setup for a head of product? Is it obviously it probably depends on the product and the complexity of it. Maybe you have some DevOps person, you have a full stack engineer, you have some junior engineers, maybe you have some specialization on the front end and the back end, maybe you have a QA person. But what is like the ideal setup going into a company as they're scaling, once they're past the MVP model, maybe they're at a version 2 or version 1, but getting them kind of to that, I guess, operating point where they're operating at a high efficiency, where you can kind of actually implement certain features or kind of roadmap items. What does that ideal team look like when you're at that level looking to scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I usually look for some kind of product team to exist. So that can be very small, very nimble. It can be just a product manager who's able to work on designs, full stack developer, front end, back end, something like that at least. And then from there, I think the head of product kind of role is really trying to figure out where in that overall process that worked when you were just 2 or 3 people, what's breaking down now, right? Like now that you've scaled up, the model has like stopped working as well as it used to. Why? Right. Because it could be any number of things. Like if you could show up and start redoing the way you do one pagers or doing sprint planning or something like that. But if your problem is discovery, those things are unlikely to really help. So I think anyone can really be a head of product. It's really just about applying that kind of like levels thinking and saying like, well, okay, how do I zoom out and what's the right time scale or altitude to look at this problem? What's the right level? Like, where's this breaking down? And if you can identify that, then you can very quickly do things that will help that area and then just kind of like normal product, iterate on it. You just kind of lather, rinse, repeat.
Yeah, yeah. And I also like to think about the testing and kind of that whole phenomenon. Everybody talks about, oh, you got to A/B test different features of the product, where things are, how someone's experience is going to be. But once you get to actually doing that or have a hypothesis, how do you kind of implement a test so that you're not only having two very separate experiences, but you're able to collect the right information and then compare those kind of different tests to then make that decision? How do you kind of set up that structure and really test the right components of that hypothesis that your company might have or that the product might have?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that A/B testing has a place, and it's a very well understood tool in the toolbox, but it's only one of many. And so my advice is always go back to like really think about what you're trying to test. Because if you're trying to test an assumption, the better you can articulate what it is you assume, the more ways of testing that assumption you'll see. And A/B testing may be one of them, but it may be as simple as like sending a text message to someone, telling them, or putting a fake button on the website to say like, hey, click here to do this thing. And then if they click on it, that's a sign that they're like curious and interested. I think sometimes people, especially in your product journey, you learn a tool or a technique or a mechanism, and then suddenly everything kind of looks like it can be solved in that problem. And it certainly can. But oftentimes there are many adjacent ways or adjacent tools or methods or techniques that can get another way of testing that assumption, right? Even just asking a question, calling somebody and asking them, hey, when's the last time you did this? Can tell you just as much as like an A/B test would in a week. So
yeah, it's amazing to kind of structure it and really kind of get to the weeds of identifying what to work on, what to test, and how to collect those results. Because oftentimes some of that stuff just I mean, I've had a few campaigns, even just like on a smaller level, go nowhere because I wasn't testing the right thing. And so getting to that point and understanding that is definitely, I think it takes a little bit of intuition, but it takes a lot of that structure in those components. I know we talked a lot about you in kind of the product standpoint, but shifting gears to Nexleaf, obviously the nonprofit space and with technology advancing, it's getting a lot of upgrades and it's really creating an ecosystem where accessibility really has no barrier as long as you have, say, some component of technology, whether applications on a phone or a laptop or desktop. That's becoming so much of a normal. People could access technology information. But describe Nexleaf, what you're building, and what in particular is exciting about the I don't know if it's upgrades, but evolution of technology that has allowed you to do what you guys are doing today. Describe the technology, describe the company and what your mission and goal is.
Definitely. Yeah. So at Nexleaf, our goal is to protect the vaccine supply in countries. The way that we do that is we help ministries sort of like upgrade their cold chain system. Yeah, so vaccines, they have to be stored. Not everybody knows this. Vaccines have to be stored at like between 2 to 8 Celsius in order to remain potent. And if you wander too far outside of that temperature for too long, then they don't work as well. They start to lose potency. So a lot of resources around the world go into just trying to keep vaccines at the right temperature before you administer them. And so that's what we do. We make a remote temperature monitoring, RTM device. It's a sensor that goes into fridges and monitors the temperature. And then we collect that temperature, we send it to our application, and that lets us do things like send an SMS alert as soon as the temperature is drifting out of range. So we can text a nurse or a facility in charge or a biomedical engineer to say, hey, the temperature in this fridge is too hot or too cold. Make sure you act on that. And then also I think having that high resolution temperature data. So normally a lot of facilities will monitor the temperature twice a day. They'll take a morning reading and an evening reading and they'll log it in this chart. But we can take hundreds or thousands of samples over the course of the day. And that like order of magnitude higher resolution data really unlocks a lot of capability because you can see things like, for example, a compressor starting to fail because it's cycling on and off a lot, or you can see like the ways that the patterns of temperatures changing, which tells you a bunch. So that's what we do is we monitor the temperatures in these facilities. We help ministries act on that data, take all this temperature data and make sense of it, use it to highlight the challenges that maybe they're facing and what they can do about it. Yeah. And it's been great so far. We're currently protecting the vaccine supply for something like 1 in 10 babies in the world with over 20,000 devices in 33 countries.
Wow, it's incredible to think about having that kind of really sophisticated measurements in real time, what that allows you to understand, obviously faulty equipment, things like that. But my question is like, how slow was the incumbent process beforehand? If you're taking a morning reading and an afternoon reading, technically something could be good in the morning or night, and then by the next reading, it could be spoiled and supply could be gone. And what does that actually
Yeah.
mean with that latency? What does that latency mean in terms of how much supply is lost in cases where things don't go well?
Yeah, exactly. I think you get it. What we're replacing or what we're helping to displace is a lot of paper chart logging, a lot of phone calls to try to just get the information that you can. So these are often in facilities, you'll see these like paper charts that have like 30 days at a time. And nurses and staff like log the temperature twice a day. They sign it to verify that they did it. And then at the end of the month, that those charts are like carried to the district or the regional office, where maybe they're collated with other reports or their data is typed in by hand into a spreadsheet or something like that. But that's just to get to the starting point of analyzing it and trying to make sense of it. So when you think about the fact that it's like, hey, in real time, I can tell you what happened over the last 5 days in your facility with this fridge. That's a capability that just is impossible to get otherwise, right? Like that same level of like low latency response, real time nature. So I think it's super exciting. And we hear stories all the time about the ways that people are using this. Like I hear stories all the time that sound like, hey, I went home on Friday, the clinic is closed over the weekend, and I got an alert on Saturday that like the power had gone out and the temperature was rising in this fridge. And so I called the security guard there, and they went and they plugged in the propane generator and they turned it on. And so, but then on the next day I got another alert. And so we went there and we realized the hose had become clogged. So if you hadn't done that, you would have shown up Monday and thousands of vaccines would have been spoiled. But by being able to act on it when it happened, they could take corrective action and save all those vaccines.
Yeah, and how often does that occur? Obviously, Nexleaf is looking to resolve that problem, but how often does that occur? I don't know if you have any numbers that you can share with us on how often vaccines go, say, spoiled, or go and aren't in the right environment for the longevity of them being in the fridge or in a facility. And what does that mean to people who are then seeking out those vaccines, but then don't have a supply of them? How difficult is it for those facilities to then get more vaccines?
Yeah. It's a challenge. I don't have any like hard numbers on exactly how many excursions happen and how many alerts we send out, but it's a regular occurrence, especially when you consider that an entire country is operating. Every day there's probably some fridge somewhere that's not behaving well. The vaccines it's like a cumulative impact on the potency. So it's not like, hey, the moment it gets hotter than 8, this vaccine's toast. It's like, starts to lose some potency. And depending on how long it's been there, it starts to have a bigger impact. So nurses can always check on the vial to see like, hey, is this vaccine still potent? There's a sticker called a VVM that tells you like how potent this is, or if this vaccine is no longer expected to work the way that it ought to. So there's always that. But yeah, there's a ton of work that goes into just trying to manage all of these power outages, fridge failures, getting spare parts. And a huge challenge is just even when things go well, distributing vaccines through a country is hard work. Oftentimes they'll land at something like a central vaccine store, and then they'll be distributed through regional and district vaccine stores until they get to the facility. But some of these facilities can be very remote. And so a failure there, it's not just about the money of vaccines being lost, although that is also super big and important. It's all the logistics that go into getting it to this place as well, that now you have to repeat. Now you have to find another truck to drive 100 kilometers to come distribute these vaccines. So yeah, it's definitely a big challenge.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering, in terms of from a product standpoint, what has been really the evolution? I feel like the IoT kind of devices space was popular, but really kind of under the radar now in cases like yours, where you don't have to say integrate into, say, a refrigerator's or a facility's whole system, right? It kind of is a standalone. What does that allow you in terms of the ability to move quickly, get into facilities, start testing? How fast is that speed? And what advances in IoT devices have you seen in the last, say, 5 years that really allows the expansion of this whole industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that evolution in IoT and in tech is really what's part of what's enabling this whole opportunity.
Yeah.
And a big one is, as I have an IoT background, I've worked at a couple IoT companies. A big one is like the advances in low power wireless technologies. So Bluetooth has only gotten more and more efficient, lower and lower power, longer and longer ranges. And so our next generation temperature monitoring device has wireless sensors. They're actually like little Bluetooth powered temperature sensors. And then at the same time, battery life, and batteries have become cheaper and cheaper. We're able to find really long life batteries. And so the combination of like using less power on the Bluetooth side plus bigger and higher capacity batteries means like right now with our next device, we can go for like 7 years just on a single battery charge without having to replace up. So I think those are the big advances. Broadly speaking, anything that moves forward the network connectivity makes it easier to get to the cloud. Right. So I'm super excited to see the way that things like mesh networks are playing out, and low power wireless, LoRaWAN, those technologies are helping to just make it more accessible, make it easier to get data from wherever you are in the world up to the cloud. So super cool stuff.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating thinking about kind of the evolution of these products in different ways. But one thing in particular, in terms of how your business is structured, is having all this data and all this insight on the machines that facilities are using, and you're starting to collect this huge database in terms of that maybe can be useful. Have you all thought about collecting data for, say, a certain refrigerator type, make and model for a certain company, and selling that back to them, letting them know, hey, on average, your refrigerator doesn't keep temperature consistent for more than X amount of time. How have you been able to kind of also optimize for collecting that information and using it to build partnerships with these companies who are bringing these big machines to facilities, and also helping facilities buy the right products? Honestly, it's almost like you got a consumer report on the best refrigerators or the best kind of facilities and equipment that's on the market. Have you all kind of thought about collecting that information and what that means to even furthering the benefits that your company has for your partners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what's really exciting is I think of data at a company like ours as kind of like a flywheel. And it's like, you got to get it going. But then once it starts going, it's like, oh, you can do all these other things now that you're generating all of this data, and you can use it in many different ways. I largely call that the analytics side of our business, right? It's like we have two kind of strategies or motions. One of them is operations, where it's like, hey, we're working with ministries of health to really solve the problems that matter to them. And the way we're going to do that is by like listening to them, understanding what it is they're trying to do, what's preventing them from being able to do that today, and then like try to find ways to solve that. Because I bet that if we do that well, if we're able to build a good operational product, something you can use every single day to solve the kinds of problems you see, then we'll have all of this data that we can begin to analyze and, like you said, look at fridge performance by make and model, maybe help you find out how old are the fridges in your country, maybe run an analysis to say, hey, is it worth continuing to replace parts on that 40-year-old fridge? Maybe it would be better to just replace it. Maybe that would play out. So there's all kinds of really exciting possibilities. We have a couple data scientists on our team who just do that. They just crunch the numbers and they find all kinds of exciting new things you can tell. And I'm consistently, no kidding, blown away by what you can tell just from like time series temperature data. Like all it is at the end of the day is just like this little wiggle of a line. And they're like, oh, I can tell that the holdover time on that fridge isn't what it's supposed to be, or I can tell the compressor's going out, or it's amazing. But yeah, we're just barely scratching the surface of the analytics capabilities.
Yeah. And shifting gears here, thinking about the company a little bit more so, whether it's external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that you think Nexleaf faces today?
Yeah. I think the biggest one is that global health in particular is very much like a systems problem. So what I mean by that is like here, there are a lot of markets in like the tech space are kind of like little independent entities. It's like, oh, hey, you need some kind of cloud provider. I can just operate in that space and I don't have to look outside. I don't have to care like what your deployment or your branching strategy is or how you run your product teams or anything like that. I can just be this like little slice. And coming from IoT, this is kind of what I saw in the commercial IoT space, is that everybody had their gates, their little boundaries, their little markets that they play in. You'd have people who are like, hey, I make chips. And you have people saying, hey, I make modules out of those chips. And you have people saying, hey, I
Yeah.
make IDEs or debuggers for those chips, and just like these little slices that you stack up into a solution. Global health isn't like that. Global health is much more interconnected. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge is that it's like, hey, this facility doesn't have electricity and we need to somehow power our IoT device. We can't really say, oh, that's not our problem. It's much better for us to say, oh, well, can we like find solar? Can we find a way to make it happen?
Yeah.
And that's like, it's nice that we have that just kind of broad mandate to just figure it out. But it does make it hard to figure out where to get started sometimes, because you're like, oh boy, this is just, there's so many different ways we could go on this. How do you pick a direction, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about kind of long-term wise, what's the long-term vision for the company? If everything goes well, of course.
Yeah. So, the long-term vision for Nexleaf, first, we want to get to protecting 1 in 5 babies, right? 1 in 10 right now. We think we can get to 1 in 5. The way that we do that is primarily by getting to end-to-end temperature monitoring. So, what I would call from factory to arm. It's like, hey, the moment this vaccine arrives in country, every segment that it goes through, I want to be able to monitor the temperature in that segment so that we can make sure everything's working the way it ought to at that level.
Yeah.
That also, once we have that, again, building this flywheel of data, that enables us to do things like build this like a connected clinic, almost like taking facilities and facility workers and using data to solve all kinds of problems that are hard for them, right? Like, hey, maybe I can use this data to make the case for getting new generators or more fuel for my generators this month, or things like that. Broadly speaking, I think using data to help people who are definitely worthy of the help get the resources that they're looking for to solve their problems. That's what I hear all the time. It's like, I know this is a problem. I need some help convincing other people like what we should do about it. And I think if we have all of this data, we have this platform, we can actually do that.
Yeah. You have to have the evidence to back up, right? Any claim, especially when you're thinking about investing. I'm sure these machines aren't cheap. In fact, vaccine supplies aren't cheap. It's like a lot of mass, it's a lot of dollars, but with the right evidence, of course, everything kind of moves forward in the direction you want it to, which is awesome to see. I always love this section. I call it my FAQ section. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we get.
Okay, let's go.
All right. First question I always like to open it up is, what's particularly hard about your job?
Particularly hard. Okay, so particularly hard about my job is that we're a global remote company and I live on the West Coast. So most of our team is 12 hours different. So I have a lot of very early mornings.
Yeah. Well, what are some ways that you kind of keep culture and honestly, really honestly, just you keep the communication at a high speed so that you aren't dealing with that latency? Because, you're not the only founder. Many companies are dealing with that global team and time difference. What are some structural kind of operational structures that you have within your team that allows that communication to still be at high speed as if you were in office?
Yeah. I think the biggest strategy for us is like just trying to push as much decision making to the edge, as I like to say, making sure like instead of waiting for me to wake up to ask me, hey, can we do this? How can I give you everything I know so that when you see this problem, you can know the answer and you can just do it, right? And that way you don't have to wait for everybody. It's like what happens is you wait for one person to wake up and then they respond and then now you're asleep. And so everything explodes outward. But if you can invest into creating systems that share that context, then you can empower anybody at the edge of your organization. When they see a problem, you can go and figure out what the right thing to do is. You don't have to wait for permission or, someone to wake up and tell you what they know.
And is that using, say, a platform, like almost like a Kanban board, or is that like having really strong notation about the process and procedures internally? Obviously, sharing knowledge and sharing it to a point that they can make a decision is ideal, but how do you do that? What are some things that you do? Is it writing notes and posting them? What are some things that you do to really communicate that information?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of companies, we use Slack for a lot of our internal communications. I think that helps. We're big Loom users these days, so we do a lot of video messages, which I think also helps. I think part of it is just having many different pathways, like many different ways available. Like what I've found is that some people prefer emails, some people prefer digital whiteboards, some people prefer quick Slack chats, Looms. So just kind of having all of those pathways open enables everybody to kind of communicate in the way that works best for them. I also think investing in just good questions, right? Like helping level up people's thinking and saying like, hey, we're a company that thinks out loud. So, you aren't going to see a lot of final, highly polished presentations or documents. What you will see is a lot of rough drafts, right? And that's a cultural thing, just building that expectation that's like, hey, we can't afford to wait for the final answer. I'm going to give you the work in progress. And you can see that move and evolve. And that will also tell you like what's going on very quickly.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned earlier, which I'm particularly interested about in terms of the future of Nexleaf, is really being there for the whole supply chain of that vaccine, from the creation of it to it in transit and also it staying in the facility. Just out of speculation, what will get you there, and how long do you think it'll get you there? Is it the smallest IoT device known to mankind, or is it advancements in that technology? Is it creating something else, a whole different product that is able to kind of harbor vaccines for the longevity of the supply chain? I'm curious, just for speculation sense, what can get you there to be kind of there, present during the whole supply chain process?
Yeah, that's a great question. What comes to mind immediately is just more advances in that like wireless network technology. So I mentioned earlier, like things like LoRaWAN are super exciting to me, but there's movement in things like the Helium network, these like kind of blockchain incentivized networks that are popping up all over the place. And I think that's really the key to that last mile. It's like, we're always going to be able to work in major metropolitan areas and their surrounding neighborhoods, and maybe even like getting out into some of the more remote facilities. But there's going to be some that are like very far away from any cellular network. And it's a hard pitch to get a cell company to invest in putting up a tower just for temperature data at this one facility. So I think it's super exciting. Things like Starlink as well, like the ways that you're finding all of these different paths to the internet without requiring a bunch of an infrastructure investment. Those things I think are really going to enable us to go truly end to end in country.
Yeah, it's so fascinating thinking about those possibilities and where you can reach. And also, like you said, the different ways, the interconnectivity of information and internet can really kind of propel that forward outside of just creating really sophisticated, advanced hardware, which there's challenges to both, but it seems like everything is moving in the right direction, which is awesome. I always like to ask this question because I love how our guests can extract knowledge out of anything that they ingest. Whether it was early in your career or now, what books or people have influenced you the most?
Oh man, how much time do we have? I think a couple that really come to mind are Continuous Discovery Habits, Teresa Torres' great book. I think she's done a really great job kind of illustrating how fast you can make discovery to the point where it's continuous, right? Like you're just constantly talking to customers and learning the insights you need to. So fantastic book there. Aaron Dingham's book, Brave New Work, is hugely influential for me from just a company culture perspective, that decentralization, really promoting a company culture that is positive about the people that work in it and curious about the complexity of human interaction, and really starting from those principles and how you structure your company. Big influence. Of course, anything Marty Kagan's written, Empowered, Inspired, all of his product thinking books have been the fingerprints of my thinking are there for sure.
I love that. I love asking this question because we always get new and answers and really kind of create this really homogenous way to think differently and to access information. I love asking that question because when you're scaling a company, every individual on there has such a broad sense of where they get their information from. So it's awesome to hear your input there. I know we're at the end of the show, so last little bit is I want to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table. Is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have or that you would have liked to answer? Anything left here?
Oh man, no, I think you did a great job. We really covered everything I could have hoped to, so thank you very much.
Of course, Chris. And last little bit is where can we find you, support you, and also support Nexleaf? Give us your websites, your LinkedIns, your Twitters, wherever we can go and be supportive, not only the product, but you as the head of product for Nexleaf.
Yeah. So we're, Nexleaf Analytics, nexleaf.org. We are a nonprofit, so you're always welcome to make a donation. That helps us. I'm LinkedIn, CC Mills. I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone who's interested. So I love building product. I love building it with and for people. I love helping others do the same. So really happy to give advice or talk to anyone.
Amazing. One question, actually, that was supposed to be the end, but I wanted to ask one thing because it came to mind. Where, as a product person, where do you go to find out your information and really understand what is on the cutting edge to what people are attracted to, how things work? Where do you kind of foster that community or get that information from a product standpoint, if I'm looking to really build something that's going to be valuable to my users and build in innovative ways that other companies are trying so that my technology can kind of be at that cutting edge? Where do you go?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of my reading these days is in Substack. So John Cutler from Amplitude has a great blog there, The Beautiful Mess, that I get a lot of insights from. Marty Kagan at SVPG, Silicon Valley Product Group, their website has a ton of really insightful articles and a newsletter that's helpful. The Every newsletter as well, more kind of just general tech trends, but I can't help but get some insights as to how things are moving there. And then finally, kind of a curveball, there's a gentleman named Simon Wardley who writes a lot about kind of the commoditization of networks and how movement implies capability. And yeah, a ton of his stuff I find really insightful, although it's a little more academic, but it's super interesting to me.
I love that, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing not only your background, your experience, advice as well, but also Nexleaf and how devices like this can really give us insights and really kind of tackle problems of whether it's latency or inefficiencies, or really just give us all the knowledge we need to make sure processes are running efficient and effective, especially when in critical situations like vaccines where things could go wrong in almost an instance, in creating waves that doesn't happen, so we can still address supplies of vaccines and many other things I'm sure that it could have an effect with in the future. So I really appreciate the conversation, Chris. It was a pleasure having you on the show, and I hope you enjoyed yourself. And thank you again for being on Behind Company Lines today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you.